And joining me here on set is the now independent MP, federal MP for Hughes, Craig Kelly. Good to see you, Craig.
Yeah, no, good to be with you, Chris.
Now, you are opposed to this vaccine passport. You're going to take some legislation into Parliament to try and make it illegal?
Absolutely, a domestic vaccine passport. This is not about international travel. This is about travel within Australia's borders. Now, the Australia that I grew up in, the Australia that I believe in, you shouldn't have to have some type of papers, your health papers, to cross the Murray River or to go to Coolangatta for a holiday. You shouldn't need papers to go to the footy or the pub or to the cafe. Now, that's what I see the Prime Minister somehow talking about, floating the idea. We've seen being floated in other countries.
Well, let's take the Prime Minister's argument, though. He portrays it as allowing you in, interestingly. He doesn't see it as something that would block you, but he's saying, like, if an area is cordoned off because of the pandemic, this vaccine passport will let you go through. What do you make of that argument?
Well, firstly, Chris, it's misleading at its outset. The idea that you have this vaccine passport that somehow guarantees you from infection or spreading infection is simply not backed up by the science and the evidence. We've seen in the US and many other countries around the world, even people so-called fully vaccinated are actually catching COVID, spreading COVID, being readmitted to hospital for COVID and dying of COVID. So it's misleading and deceptive to start with. But it shouldn't be. It's against everything that I believe Australia should be. You should have freedom of travel amongst the country, amongst from one state to the other. It's just not the principles of the country that I want to see.
Yeah, it's worth exploring that, because the medical position on this is pretty obvious. So if you look at there's only two lockdowns, in my view, in this country that were justifiable. One is, of course, Greater Melbourne at the height of their outbreak. The other is the Northern Beaches lockdown in New South Wales, which was much more targeted. And Melbourne's went too far, too long or whatever, but some sort of a lockdown was required. Now, in both of those cases, if you'd been vaccinated, surely you wouldn't have been allowed out anyway, because as we know, you can still get infected and you can still pass it on if you're vaccinated. They might reduce the chances somewhat, but you can still carry the virus, right? So,
Exactly.
So why would you have an exemption?
Well, this is why the whole thing is misleading to start with. It's little more than a marketing gimmick from those that want to push the vaccines, the big vaccine company. And we've actually got the legislation that I'm proposing, Chris, is modelled of what is in Florida. And I think now 12 US states have said that we are not going to have domestic vaccine passports in our state. This is led by Governor Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. He's actually brought legislation in that state, and that's the legislation I've copied, and I'm going to introduce into federal parliament, and I hope the Prime Minister gives everyone a conscious vote.
Well, that would be interesting. I would have thought, though, obviously the US is a federation, much the same as Australia. It obviously goes against the very heart of what a federation's supposed to be. And in our case, I would have thought such a law would be illegal and unconstitutional under Section 92. I suppose you want to prevent it being passed. Not your law outlawing it, but a vaccine passport would be unconstitutional, wouldn't it?
I think for travel across state borders, it would be unconstitutional. But again, there's nothing we've seen to stop some of these states going over the top, introducing this legislation and getting away and getting side-passed in the Constitution. Someone's got to run a case. I think the best thing, let's put this in legislation. Let's copy what they've done in Florida. Let's make it very clear to everyone that domestic vaccine passports in this country are a no.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And the other point about this is the timing is just all wrong. We should be taking every step towards opening up increasingly now that we're getting the vaccine rollout, rather than looking at ever more onerous restrictions.
Look, coercion is never the way to go things. Coercion is what you see in a sort of totalitarian regime. Now, we're best if the vaccine's the best thing since sliced bread. It should be incentives, not coercion. And the idea that someone can't go and visit an elderly relative in another state or their family in other states because they have not decided to get something injected into their body is just, I think, abhorrent to all Australians.
Now, you've resigned from the Liberal Party. I would argue you weren't going to get pre-selection. You're saying other reasons. Well, but let's not go down that track. But you resigned from the Liberal Party. You're now an independent. You're happy to campaign against the Liberals in Hughes. What about a former Prime Minister and Malcolm Turnbull, still a member of the Liberal Party, campaigning against the Nationals in the Upper Hunter State by-election? Should he be allowed to remain in the Liberal Party?
Look, of course not. This is against the principles. The Liberal Party have a rule. You are not meant to campaign against a sitting member of the same party. Now, that where you're in a coalition in the state government with the Nationals, it should also apply to the national candidate. Any person that says I am a member of the Liberal Party should be up there supporting the national candidate, supporting the Berejiklian government to get their numbers back in the floor of the New South Wales Parliament. To think that a member of the Liberal Party, but look, this somehow shows that the Liberal Party that I joined, Chris, is not the Liberal Party of today.
Thanks for joining us, Craig. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Craig Kelly, the member for Hughes, as we just discussed, the former Liberal Party member, now an independent member.